The bell that had killed 4 men was still in the ground at Kelverne, and the woman walking up the drive to ask for it back was the daughter of the man who had cast it. Rosamund Cray had come the last 3 miles on foot, because the carrier would not take her past the lodge gates. He had set her down on the turnpike with her father's leather satchel and her mother's second-best bonnet, and had said, not unkindly, that he had a wife at home and she had her own way to make. And then he had turned his horse and gone back toward Marchford, without once looking at the avenue of limes that led up to the house. That was Kelverne. 6 years after the accident, grown men still would not drive up it. It was the last week of July, and the county was the color of a new sovereign. She walked in the shade with the dust turning her hem gray, and she counted things, because counting was what she did instead of being afraid. 61 limes on the left of the drive, 61 on the right, except for a gap where one had come down in a gale and never been replaced. A lodge with the shutters closed in high summer, a gravel sweep that had not been raked in a month, weeds standing in the ruts, and beyond it at the head of the rise, a great pale house with 2/3 of its windows blinded by dust sheets glowing dimly behind the glass. And to the east of the house, past the walled garden, standing above the yews in the churchyard of Nether Kelverne, the tower. She had known she would see it. She had told herself, in her mother's kitchen at Netherfold, exactly how she would behave when she did. She would look at it the way she looked at any other tower, as 40 feet of coarse limestone with a stair turret and 8 lovered openings, and she would think about the work and not about anything else. She had rehearsed it as carefully as she had rehearsed the words she meant to say to the Duke. It did not answer. She came out from under the last of the limes, and the tower stood up in the blue with its louvres boarded over from the inside, and something in the middle of her chest turned over like a coin. There were bells in there, 5 of them, hanging dumb in an oak frame, with their ropes cut off short at the ceiling. And under the tower floor, capped with stone and lead and 6 years of silence, there was the pit where the 6th one had died, and where her father's name had died with it. Nobody in that county had rung a bell for a wedding, a christening, or a funeral in 6 years. They said the ropes had been cut on the Duke's order the week the inquest closed. They said he had gone up the tower himself, with the burns still wet on him, and done it with his own 2 ruined hands, and then had the door sealed, and had never once, in 6 years, unsealed it. They said a great many other things about the 6th Duke of Kelverne as well. Rosamund had heard them all her adult life, over her own family's table, in her mother's voice. That he had been 28 years old and drunk on his father's claret, when he ordered a bell poured into a mould that any fool could see was still wet. That he had been told plainly by the founder himself, and had laughed and told the founder to run his metal, or find another county to work in, because the peal had to ring on the 15th of August, when the Regent's party would pass along the western road, and a duke's son does not care what a tradesman thinks about the weather. That the mould had blown when the metal touched it, the way a wet mould always blows, with a noise they heard 4 miles off at Marchford, and that Wilfrid Bligh and Amos Redfern and John Ganton and John Ganton's boy Peter, who was 19, had died in the casting pit in the churchyard of the church their families had rung for, since before anyone could remember, and that the fine young lord had come out of it alive, with his face burned off, which the county considered on the whole a fair exchange, and no more than the beginning of what was owed. Rosamund Cray had grown up on that story the way other girls grow up on scripture. She could have recited it. She had recited it, at 14, standing on a chair in the loam shed, in an imitation of a drawling aristocratic voice that had made the men laugh until her father came in and took her down off the chair without a word and sent her to the house. She thought about that now, going up the last of the drive with her heart going hard, and she could not think why it had come back to her, or why it sat so badly. She was 24. Her father had been dead 14 months. There were £11 and some shillings in the foundry account at Netherfold, an order book with nothing in it, a mother who had begun to talk about the workhouse in the same flat voice she used for the weather, and a brother of 18 with both forearms scarred like melted candle wax, and one ear that heard nothing at all. And 40 miles away at Ford Abbas there was a rector with a subscription of £220 in hand and a cracked tenor bell in his tower, who had written to say that he would consider a recasting from Cray of Netherfold, since Cray of Netherfold was cheap now, provided that Cray of Netherfold could supply the metal. That was the whole of it. That was why she had walked 3 miles in the dust. Bell metal was 4 parts copper to 1 of tin, and copper was 7 1/8 a pound and rising with every ship the Navy laid up. And there was not a founder in England who could put 20 hundredweight of new metal into a mould out of his own pocket. But there was 21 hundredweight of it lying in the ground under Kelverne Tower, blown and split and worth nothing to a soul on earth except a founder with a furnace and a mould to fill. It was ruined metal. It was her father's metal, and by law it belonged, every ounce, to the man who owned the ground it had frozen in. She had written to him twice. Both letters had come back unopened, with the seal unbroken and no direction on them but the word returned in a steward's hand. So she had walked up the drive. The door was opened by a housekeeper of 60 in grey stuff, with a bunch of keys at her waist, who looked at Rosamund's dusty hem and her satchel and her face, and stopped with her hand still on the door. "You're a Cray," she said. "Rosamund Cray. I've come to ask His Grace for an hour of his time. His Grace doesn't give hours. Then I'll ask for 1:15." The woman did not move for a moment. Something crossed her face that Rosamund could not read and would not be able to read for another 2 months, and would then think about for the rest of her life. It was not dislike. It was closer to fright. "You'd best come out of the sun," she said. The hall of Kelverne was cold. That was the first thing. Outside it was 78 degrees, and the gravel was hot enough to feel through a shoe. And inside there was a chill coming off the stone floor like the breath of a cellar. The second thing was that it was clean and empty and hushed in a particular way, and it took Rosamund a moment to place the particularity. There was no clock ticking anywhere. There was no dog. And when the housekeeper went away down the passage to inquire, she went in complete silence, and she did not ring for anybody, and no bell of any kind sounded anywhere in that house. Rosamund stood in the middle of the hall with her satchel against her knee and looked at a marble bust of somebody's grandfather, and told herself that she was not going to be frightened by an absence of noise. She waited 19 minutes. She knew, because she counted them. Then a door opened at the far end, and a man's voice said, "Miss Cray." She had been told what to expect. Everyone in the county thought they knew. She had been told about the mask, which did not exist, about the hood, which did not exist either, about the room he kept in darkness, which she would later find was simply the North Library, where the light was even and did not hurt his eyes. What she had not been told was that he would be standing in his own doorway in a plain black coat, with his hands bare at his sides, in full afternoon light, waiting to see what her face would do. He was tall and black-haired and 34 years old. The right side of him, from the temple down across the cheek and jaw and into the collar of his shirt, was ridged and seamed and paler than the rest of him, the skin drawn in long ropes and glazed patches the color of old wax, so that the shape of the bone underneath showed differently on that side than on the other. His right eyelid was pulled a little out of true. The scarring went down his throat and came back again over the backs of both hands, and the last 2 fingers of the right hand did not straighten. The left side of his face was the face of a handsome man who had been handsome 6 years ago and had not troubled about it since. He watched her look. He gave her the whole time she needed, deliberately with his chin up, and Rosamund understood at once that this was a thing he did on purpose, and that it was not vanity or shame, but something more like a toll gate. Pay it now, get it over with, and he would know from her face exactly what she was. She had grown up in a foundry. She had seen a man's arm after a splash of metal went into his sleeve. She had washed her brother's forearms every night for a year when she was 18 years old, and had learned to do it without changing her breathing, because he watched her breathing to know how bad it was. So she looked at him steadily, and then she curtsied and said, "Your Grace, thank you for seeing me." Something in his shoulders altered by perhaps half an inch. "You are Josiah Cray's daughter." "I am." "Then you know that no good has ever come to anyone from this house," he said. "Come in." The North Library had 1 window and a wall of books and a long table with a survey of the estate spread out on it, and waited at the corners. He did not sit down, so she did not either. He stood on the far side of the table with the flat afternoon light coming in over his shoulder, and he listened to her without once interrupting, which she had not expected, and which nearly undid her more thoroughly than rudeness would have done. She told him about Ford Abbas. She told him the subscription, the weight of the cracked tenner, the note it was pitched at, and what it would cost to bring 21 hundredweight of new metal out of Bristol. She told him what the ruined bell in his pit was worth to a scrap dealer, which was next to nothing, and what it was worth to a founder, which was everything, and she did not once say the word please, because her father had told her that a founder who begs has already quoted too low. "I would raise it at my own cost," she said. "I'd bring my own sheer legs and my own men. I'd fill the pit after and lay the stone back exactly as it lies. It needn't take above 4 days, and I would pay for the metal over 3 years out of the Ford Abbas money and whatever comes after it." He said nothing. "Your Grace, it is lying in the dark doing nothing." "Yes," he said, "it is." "Then let me have it." No, she had prepared for that. She had prepared for a dozen forms of no. What she had not prepared for was how completely he said it, without heat, without apology, without the small softening cough that men use when they are refusing a woman and would like to be thanked for it anyway. "May I ask why?" "You may ask." "Then I am asking, and I am refusing," he said. Anything else on this estate is yours for the wanting, Miss Cray. Timber, stone, the lead off the stable roof, if it would help you. Come to the steward and take £100 and no note of hand, and I will not ask you what you do with it. But no one opens that tower. Because of what happened in it? Because I have said so. She had a temper. It had cost her 2 commissions and 1 friendship, and it rose in her now like heat off a furnace door, and she put both hands flat on the table before she could stop them. 4 men died in that pit, she said, and one of them was to be married at Michaelmas. And I have carried what your father's house did to my father's house since I was 18 years old. And I did not come here to be given £100 like a beggar at a back door. I came for my own metal. It is not your metal. It has my father's mark on it. The room went quiet. He turned his head then and looked at her fully, and for the first time she saw the whole of his face square on in the light, and she saw that his eyes were grey and perfectly steady, and about 1,000 years old. Yes, he said quietly, it does. And that, she thought afterwards, was the moment when the whole of the rest of her life turned over, though she had no notion of it at the time, because she had said it as an accusation, and he had answered it like a man agreeing to something he had been waiting 6 years to be asked. He rang no bell, because there were none to ring. He went to the door himself and told the housekeeper that Miss Cray would take some tea before she walked back, and then he said, without turning round, Mrs. Ives will show you the churchyard if you ask her. You will want to see it. Everyone does. Look at the outside of the tower as long as you like. Do not put your hand on the door. It was an odd thing to say, and she thought about it all the way across the walled garden and through the little iron gate in the churchyard wall. The church of Nether Kelverne was small and honey-coloured and very old, and its tower was the finest thing in 20 miles, and it stood in the middle of a graveyard where somebody had recently scythed the grass and left the cuttings lying. 4 of the stones were newer than the others. They stood in a row on the south side, all of the same pale stone, all cut by the same hand, and the lettering was deep and good and had cost money. Wilfrid Bligh, Amos Redfern, John Ganton, Peter Ganton his son, aged 19 years, and underneath each of them, the same line, this stone set up by one who was there. Rosamund stood in front of them for a long time with her bonnet in her hand. Then she walked round the base of the tower, because she could not help herself, and she looked up at the boarded louvres, and she came round to the north side where the sun never reached, and the stone was green with damp, even in July, and she found the door. It was oak, 4 inches thick, studded, and older than anything else in the parish. It had a great iron hasp across it into a staple in the jamb, and through the eye of the hasp, where a padlock would ordinarily hang, somebody had run lead. She knew what she was looking at before she was near enough to see it properly, and her feet stopped of their own accord. Running a seal in lead is not a builder's trick or a blacksmith's. Masons use wax. Lawyers use wax. Founders use lead, because a founder has a ladle and a fire and lead to hand, and because lead is the only seal in the world that cannot be lifted and put back without the mark of the lifting on it. A founder poured it molten into the eye of the hasp so that it filled every part, and while the surface was still soft, he pressed his own stamp into it, and when it went cold, that door was shut until somebody took a chisel to it in front of witnesses. She had watched her father do it perhaps 12 times in her life. Twice on a church tower where the parish was quarrelling over the ringing. Once on his own furnace house, the winter the men came out on strike. She went closer, and she crouched down in the wet grass on the north side of Kelverne Tower in her good dress, and she looked at the seal. It was the size of a crown piece. It was dull grey and pitted with age, and there was moss growing at the edge of it. And stamped into the middle of it, sunk and clear and unmistakable, was a bell with a crown above it, and the letters I see beneath. Rosamund Cray, her father's mark. The same mark that stood on the waist of every bell he had cast in 31 years, on the base of the little handbell on her mother's mantelpiece, and on the flat iron stamp that was lying at that moment in the leather satchel 3 feet from her knee, because she carried it everywhere, because it was the only thing of his she had wanted. Her father had sealed that door, not the Duke, not the Duke's men. Her father, who had come home from Kelverne in the September of 1811, with his hands shaking, and had never worked in that parish, or spoken its name again, had gone up to that tower at some point after the inquest, with a ladle and a fire and his own stamp, and had shut it with his own hands, and had gone home and eaten his dinner, and had let his wife and his daughter and his crippled son curse the Duke of Kelverne over the table every Sunday for 6 years. Rosamund Cray knelt in the grass with her hand not quite touching the lead, and felt the ground move under her the way a floor moves when the sheer legs shift. She did not tell anyone. That was the thing she would come back to afterwards, when she was trying to be fair to herself. She did not tell her mother, she did not tell her brother, and when Mrs. Ives came looking for her with the tea she had forgotten to drink, she stood up and shook out her skirt, and said the tower was a fine piece of 15th century work, and that the parapet wanted repointing on the west face. But she went back up to the house, instead of going home, and she asked to see his Grace again. He came out to her on the terrace. He had put his gloves on. "You have thought of something else to ask me for," he said. "I have thought of something to ask you," said Rosamund. "It is not the same thing." "Then ask it. Why did my father seal your tower?" He was very still. Behind him the house stood with its blinded windows, and the heat came up off the flagstones, and somewhere down in the meadow a man was mowing, and the sound of the scythe came up to them, and went, and came again. "Because I asked him to," he said at last. "Why would he do a thing you asked? You would have to ask him." "He is dead. I know he is dead," said the Duke of Kelverne. "I paid for the stone." She stood there in the sun and could not speak. Miss Cray. He turned to face her fully. "Go home. I mean that as a kindness, which is not a thing I am much in the way of offering, so you may take it at its full value. Take the £100. Take 300. Buy your copper in Bristol, and cast your bell for Ford Abbas, and let the name of Cray be a good name again in this county, and stay out of my churchyard, and in 10 years you will thank God for it." And the tower stays shut. The tower stays shut. "Your Grace," she said, "I am not able to do that." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something that she had to make him repeat, because the first time she heard it, she was certain she had misunderstood. "Then you had better marry me." The mowing went on down in the meadow. "That is not amusing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not. Sit down, Miss Cray, and I will tell you exactly what I am offering you, and then you will go home and think about it for a week, and then you will refuse. And then we shall both know where we are." She sat down on the stone bench because her legs had decided the matter for her. He did not sit. He stood with his back half to the light and told her, in the flat, exact, unhurried voice of a man reading out an inventory, that his cousin Aubrey Sterne of Bath, who was his heir presumptive and 41 years old and in debt to 3 separate houses in London, had 6 weeks ago petitioned the Lord Chancellor for a commission in the nature of a writ de lunatico inquirendo, that the commission would sit at Marchford at Michaelmas before a jury of 23 freeholders of the county, that its business was to determine whether the 6th Duke of Kelverne was of sound mind and capable of the management of his own affairs, or whether he was a lunatic, in which case his person and his estate would be committed to a guardian, and the guardian named in the petition was Mr. Aubrey Sterne. On what grounds? She said. That I have not been seen in society in 6 years, that I keep no company, that I have refused 3 separate applications from the bishop to reopen my parish church tower, which stands sealed, and in which I permit no service of any kind to be rung, that I maintain a household of 9 where my father maintained 40, that I pay out of the estate certain sums every quarter, which my steward is not permitted to explain, and which my cousin has represented to council as the caprice of a disordered man. He paused, and that I do not, in his phrase, choose to look like a duke. That is not madness. That is grief. It is whatever 23 farmers in a hired assembly room decide it is, he said. They have known for 6 years what I am. My cousin does not have to prove me mad. He only has to remind them. Rosamund sat with her hands in her lap. And a wife? A wife, he said, is the one thing I can put in front of that jury that no counsel can argue with. A married man with a duchess in residence, receiving at his own table, opening his own house at Christmas, is not a man who has withdrawn from the world. It is a great deal harder to commit a man's person to a guardian when there is a woman standing beside him who has taken his name and shows no wish to be rid of it. He looked out over the meadow. It is a low, cold, calculating use to make of a marriage. I am aware of it. And what do I have? Everything but the tower, said the Duke. Your foundry set on its feet with new plant and a new furnace, your brother apprenticed anywhere in England you please, or to a physician, or to neither, and an income if his hands will not serve. Your mother in a house of her own, with a woman to keep it. The Kelverne name behind every quotation you ever send out for the rest of your life, which is worth more than all the rest of it together, and you know it, and your own establishment, and your own hours, and your own bed. I would not ask you for anything else. I am not offering you that kind of marriage, and I should think you can see why. She could not, in fact, see why, and it took her a moment to understand that he meant his face, and when she understood it she was so angry that she stood up. You will not want it, he said. It would be very strange in you if you did. You have not the slightest idea what I want. No, he agreed, but I know what the county says, and you will hear it every day of your life, and you had better weigh it now while it costs you nothing. They will say you sold yourself to the man who killed your father's men, for a foundry and a coronet, and that Josiah Cray's girl had her price like everybody else. They will say it in front of you at church. They will say it to your children, and what will they say to you? Nothing, said the Duke of Kelverne. They have said it all. She went home. She thought about it for 4 days, not 7. She told her mother, and Eleanor Cray put down the pen she was writing the books with and said, in a perfectly level voice, that she would rather see her daughter dead in a ditch, and then went out to the loam shed and did not come back until dark. She told her brother. Nathaniel was 18 and had their father's shoulders and hands he kept in his pockets when strangers were by, and he heard her out with his good ear turned toward her, and at the end of it he said, "Is he a cruel man?" "No," said Rosamund, and was surprised at how quickly she said it. "Then I don't care what they call him." But she did not tell either of them about the lead seal with their father's mark on it, and she knew, lying awake on the 4th night listening to the house tick, that this was the true reason she was going to say yes. Not the furnace, not the name, not even Nathaniel. She was going to marry the Duke of Kelverne because he had a door she could not get through and a dead man's signature on the lock, and because she had discovered in herself a want so strong it frightened her, the want to know what her father had done. She wrote to Kelverne on the 5th day. The answer came back within 4 hours, 3 lines long in a strong crabbed hand that got worse toward the end of every word, because the fingers that held the pen did not close properly. "Michaelmas is 9 weeks off. It must be soon, and it must be here. I am sorry for it. K." They were married on the 14th of August in the church of Nether Kelverne at 10:30 in the morning, by license. It was the plainest wedding that parish had seen in 100 years, and every soul in it came to watch. They filled the pews, and they stood at the back, and they lined the wall of the churchyard 4 deep along the path, and not one of them had been invited. Rosamund wore ivory, because her mother's wedding gown had been ivory, and because she had not been able to make herself buy anything new with Kelverne money before the thing was done. Her mother did not come. Nathaniel came and stood up with her, and shook so badly through the first half of the service that she had to put her hand over his on the pew rail. The rector, Miss Peveril, read the service in a voice like a man walking on ice. He was a kind and frightened person of about 60, who had not been able to look at his own tower in 6 years, and twice he lost his place, and once he said the wrong name and had to go back, and when it was done and the register was signed, she wrote Rosamund Cray for the last time and looked at it a moment too long. They came out through the south door into the sun, and the whole parish was waiting, and there was no sound at all. That was the thing she had not prepared for. A wedding is a noise. A wedding is the 6 bells going over the roofs and the boys shouting, and the ringers coming down red-faced into the daylight to be given beer. She had rung at weddings herself, as a girl, in her father's parish, standing on a box to reach the sally. Above her head, in a boarded tower 40 feet up, 5 bells hung in an oak frame with their ropes cut off at the ceiling. Nobody threw anything. She would remember that. They stood along both sides of the path with their arms folded, men and women and children, in their working clothes on a Thursday morning. And they let the new Duchess of Kelverne walk out into the silence. And they looked at her. She got 11 yards down the path. Then a woman came out of the crowd on the left, an upright, dry-faced woman of about 50, in a black stuff gown that had been black a long time, and she was carrying something coiled over her arm like washing. "Mercy Ganton," said the Duke, behind her. Not loudly, just the name. The woman did not look at him. She came across the path in 3 steps and lifted the coil off her arm and dropped it over Rosamund's head. It was a bell rope. 3 inches of it were fine hemp furred with age, and there was a woolly grip in the middle of it, striped cream and grey, worn shiny where a man's hands had gone year after year. It went over her bonnet and down onto her shoulders, and the weight of it was much greater than she expected, and the smell of it came up into her face, hemp and dust and tallow and the inside of a tower. The cut end hung against her waist. It was frayed and old, and it had been cut on a slant, from below by somebody standing under it with a knife and no ladder. "That's my husband's," said Mercy Ganton, in a perfectly conversational voice. He had the tenor. 22 year. "You'll want a rope in that house, my lady. There's none in it. And you'll want to know what a rope's for, being in the trade." There was a low sound from the crowd. Not a cheer. Something worse than a cheer. Rosamund stood with the dead rope round her neck in her mother's ivory gown, and her hands were black to the wrist because she had spent 4 hours the morning before helping Nathaniel break out a mold and had scrubbed and it had not come off, and one white glove was ruined in her fist because she had pulled it off in the vestry to sign her name. She did not cry. She did not take the rope off, either. She looked at the flagstones under her shoes and she made herself count them, and the whole path was full of people waiting to see what she would do, and behind her right shoulder, half a step back, her husband stood in the full morning light, in his navy black coat and his white cravat, with the whole of his ruined face bare to the sun, and every line of it plain, and looked at Mercy Ganton and did not say one word. Afterwards she thought that if he had spoken then, she would have hated him. If he had defended her, or ordered them off, or paid them, she would have hated him for the rest of her life. What he did was wait. He gave her the path. And when she lifted her head at last, he was watching her, and she saw in his face something that was not pity and not shame, but a kind of grim, exhausted recognition, as though he had been introduced at last to the only other person in England who spoke his language. She walked the rest of the path with the rope on her. She wore it into the carriage. She wore it up the drive. She carried it into the hall of Kelverne and put it down on the marble table by the door, coiled with the Sally uppermost, and it stayed on that table for 11 weeks, and no servant in that house ever dared to move it. Her first dinner as a duchess was cold chicken and a bottle of hock at 8 o'clock in a dining room with 16 chairs, at a table laid for 2 at opposite ends, because Mrs. Ives had not liked to presume. "Move mine," said Rosamund. Mrs. Ives moved it. They ate 3 feet apart at the corner of a table that could have seated the county, and the Duke asked her what she thought of the parapet on the west face, and she told him, at length with numbers, and he listened. Then he set down his glass and said, "There are 3 things, and then we need never discuss them again. Go on. The north rooms are mine. You may come into them whenever you please, but you will find me in them, and I do not always answer at once, and it is better to come in daylight." He turned the glass by the stem. "Second, there is a great deal of talk in the village. You will hear it from the servants, from the shop at Marchford, and in church. You are not to answer it, not on my account, and not on your own. Nothing you say will alter it, and every word will be repeated to my cousin's attorney between now and Michaelmas. And third, you do not go into the tower," said the Duke of Kelverne, You do not put your hand on the seal, you do not take a chisel to it, you do not send a man up the outside for a wager, and you do not ask me again." Rosamund put down her fork. "Then tell me what is in it," she said, "and I shall not need to." "No. You have married me for a jury, your grace, and I have married you for a furnace, and we are neither of us pretending otherwise. But I will not live 9 weeks in a house with a locked room in it." "Yes," he said, "you will. That is precisely what I am paying you to do." And then, before she could get her breath, in a completely different voice, "I beg your pardon. That was unpardonable." "It was. It is also true. And I am too tired to be graceful about it." He looked at his ruined hands on the cloth. "Miss Cray, my lady, I have exactly 2 things left in the world. One is a name that everybody in this county has agreed to spit on, and I find I can live without it. The other is behind that door. And if it is opened by the wrong person, in the wrong month, in front of the wrong men, then 4 families in this parish who have been fed for 6 years stop being fed, and 1 dead man's name goes into the newspapers, and none of it will do the smallest good to anybody living." He raised his eyes. "So no, ask me anything else. Ask me tonight, I am not going anywhere." "Which dead man?" "Anything else," said the Duke. She learned the house in a fortnight, because that was how she learned anything, by walking it and touching it and taking the numbers. Kelverne had 91 rooms and 9 servants. 60 of the rooms were shut with the furniture under Holland covers and the shutters bolted, and in those rooms the air was so still that her candle stood straight up. In the rest, life went on at a strange half-pace, good plain food, fires laid and not lit, the plate polished by a boy who had never in his life seen it used. And in the passage outside the servants' hall there was a bell-board. It was a fine one, mahogany, with 31 bells in a row on their coiled springs and a painted label under each. Library yellow room, His Grace, Her Grace, chapel passage, east bedchambers 1 through 6, and on, the nerve system of a great house. Every wire had been cut. She found it on her 9th day, on an errand for candles, and she stood in the cold passage with a chamber stick in her hand, and looked up at that board, and felt the hair rise on her arms. They had not been taken down. They had been snipped off short where they came through the wall, 31 of them, so that the bells hung there dumb over their labels, and the springs had gone rusty, and a spider had got the whole left-hand end. 30 of them. The 31st wire ran on, over the top of the board, and along the ceiling of the passage, and away through the wall into the north side of the house. And it was bright. Not new bright. Rubbed clean along its whole length by 6 years of somebody pulling it. Its label said North Library. Rosamund stood there for a long time. Then she went and found Mrs. Ives in the still room and asked, in the most careless voice she could manage, who rang the North Library bell. Mrs. Ives went on stoning plums. "His Grace has it in his own hand," she said. "Then who does he ring for?" "He doesn't ring for anybody," said Mrs. Ives. "He pulls it of a night, sometimes. 12, 1 o'clock. It don't come through to the hall, the hammer's off it. Mr. Follett had the hammer off it 4 year ago because it woke the girls." She set down her knife. "There's nothing in that, my lady. It's only he can't hear a bell any more, that's all, and he pulls it to feel it go." That night Rosamund lay awake in a bedchamber, the size of a barn, and thought about a man in a dark room at 1 in the morning, pulling a wire that had been cut so that it rang in no room in the world. And something in her chest hurt in a way she had no name for and did not at all care for. She got up on the 11th night to close her shutters against the rain and saw a light moving in the churchyard. It was after midnight. The light came out from the walled garden gate, went along the wall, and stopped on the north side of the tower where the grass was always wet, and stayed there. She watched it for 40 minutes. It did not move. It did not go in. In the morning she walked out early and went round to the north face, and the grass in front of the door was pressed flat in a patch the size of a man, and beaded with rain, and on the lead seal with her father's mark on it, there was a smear where somebody had put the flat of his hand and taken it away again. Nobody had opened that door in 6 years. But somebody had been standing outside it in the rain, every wet night, for 6 years, with his hand on it, the way you stand at the side of a bed. Mr. Aubrey Stern came on the 26th of August, uninvited, with a valet, a physician, and 4 trunks. He was 41, plump, scented, beautifully dressed, in a bottle green coat, and he had the family grey eyes in a face that had never in its life been asked to hold still. He came into the hall of Kelverne like a man coming into a room he has already measured for carpet, and he kissed Rosamund's hand and held it a moment too long and said, "So this is the bride. My dear cousin, you sly creature." And a Cray. The audacity of it. "My dear Duchess, I am your servant, I am ravished, and I must tell you at once that half the county thinks you a saint, and the other half thinks you an adventuress, and I am wholly of the second party, which is why we shall get on delightfully." "Mr. Stern," said Rosamund, "Aubrey, we are family. Family is what I am here about." He beamed. "This is Dr. Lemon. He is very learned. He wrote a monograph on morbid seclusion which I could not understand a word of. Doctor, that is the tower, out of the window there. Do look at it, that is the one." Dr. Lemon was a dry grey person who did as he was told and made no apology for it, and over the following 4 days he asked Rosamund 40 or 50 questions in the mild, sideways manner of a man taking soundings. Did his Grace sleep? Did he eat at regular hours? Had she observed him talking when there was nobody by? Did he keep to one room? Was there violence? Was there weeping? Did he go out at night? "He walks," said Rosamund. "So do I. It is a large garden, and there are no dogs to bark at us." "Alone, ma'am?" "With me," said the Duchess of Kelverne, and looked the physician in the eye, and lied to him with a steadiness that surprised her very much, and did not repent of it for 1 second. It was the lie, she thought later, that decided her. Not the wedding, not the rope. There is a moment in the making of any alliance when you tell your first untruth on somebody's behalf, and after that you are in it, and everything else follows. She began, in the ordinary way of the days, to gentle him. She did not think of it in those terms. She would have been offended at the word. What she did was this. She had the Holland covers off the long drawing room, and the shutters opened, because a house full of shut rooms will testify against a man in front of a jury. She made him sit for the tenants' dinner on the 1st of September, and she put him at the head of the table, where every soul could see him, and she talked so much and so knowledgeably about drainage and wheat and the price of Bristol copper that by the pudding 4 farmers had forgotten what they were looking at. She found out that he could not any longer hold a pen for above 10 minutes because of the contracture in the right hand, and that he had been doing his own correspondence at night in agony, rather than dictate it to Follett, and she began simply to sit down at the desk each morning at 11 and say, "Go on," until it became a habit, and then a fixture, and then, without either of them noticing, the best hour of the day. She found out that he ate nothing before noon because chewing on the right side was slow and he did not wish to be watched at it, and so she took to having a tray of bread and cold beef sent to the North Library at 9, and eating half of it herself, loudly, with her boots on the fender. She found out that his gloves were kid and stiff, and that he wore them because his hands frightened people, and because he could not feel through them, and one evening she put her own hand flat on the table, a founder's hand, short-nailed, with a white seam of old burn across the ball of the thumb where a splash had gone in when she was 16, and said nothing about it at all, and left it lying there while she read aloud. And after about 20 minutes, he took the gloves off and laid them on the arm of the chair, and neither of them ever mentioned it. Nathaniel came over on the second Sunday, on the mare, with his hands in his pockets. He had been coming for a fortnight and turning back at the lodge. This time he came up, and Rosamund took him round the garden and the stables and the ruined tennis court, and talked at him until his shoulders came down. And then they went in, and the Duke was in the hall. Rosamund saw her husband stop. She saw him look at the boy's forearms below the rolled sleeves, at the puckered shining skin from wrist to elbow on both, at the way the left hand curled a little, and she saw his whole face go still in the particular way it did when something had gone through him. "Nat," she said, "this is His Grace." "Sir," said Nathaniel, and put out his right hand before he could think better of it, and then remembered what it looked like and began to take it back. The Duke took it. He took it in his own scarred right hand, the one with the 2 fingers that did not straighten, and held it, and looked at it, and said, "You have a founder's hands, Mr. Cray." Nathaniel went scarlet. "I've a bad ear as well," he said. "You'll have to stand on my right. So has half the county. After 4 years of my father's shooting parties. Come and see the survey. The eastern boundary is nonsense, and I want a man who can read a line." They were in the North Library an hour and a half. When Rosamund came in at last, they had the estate plan spread out, and Nathaniel was actually arguing, with a Duke about a ditch. But her husband was standing at the window with his back to the room, and had been for some time, and did not turn round when she came in. At the door, going out, Nathaniel stopped and said, "That's a queer thing." "What is?" "His voice," said her brother. "I've heard it before somewhere. It's like something out of when I was little." And he shrugged and went to fetch the mare, and Rosamund stood in the passage with the cold coming up off the flags. She found the quarterly book on the 12th of September, and she found it by accident, which is the only way anybody ever found anything in that house. Follett had gone to Marchford, and she had wanted the tithe figures, and the tithe figures were in the second ledger. And behind the second ledger on the shelf in the steward's room, there was a slim black book with no title on the spine at all. It was an account. 4 names, 4 columns, 24 rows, 6 years of quarter days. S. Bly, widow, £9. M. Ganton, widow, £12, and a further 4 for the boy's stone the first year. A. Redfern, widow, £9. E. Bly, mother, £6. And a 5th column added in the 3rd year, in the same hand, headed only with a letter, C. under sea, quarter by quarter, sums of 11 and 15 and 20 pounds. And against them, in the narrow margin, in the steward's small script, the reasons. Surgeon Marchford for the boy's arms. Second opinion, bath rent at Netherfold, half year, Eldy day. Copper, on act, to keep the shop open. Coals, rent, Michaelmas, doctor, rent, funeral charges, J. Cray and the stone, 14/8. Rosamund stood in the steward's room at Kelverne and read her own family's life going down a column in another man's ledger. The surgeon her mother had said was paid for by the sale of the pony. The second opinion at Bath that her father had said was got for nothing through an old friend. The rent, which had not gone up in 6 years, from a landlord in Bristol they had never once seen. The coals. Her father's coffin. She put the book back exactly where it had been, and went out into the garden, and was sick behind the yew hedge. Then she went and got the tools. She did it that night, at 1 in the morning, in the rain, and she did it with a lamp, a small charcoal chafing dish, a ladle, a chisel with a rounded face, and her father's iron stamp out of the leather satchel. Because here is the thing that the Duke of Kelverne, for all his careful arrangements, had never once thought of. A lead seal cannot be lifted and put back without the mark of the lifting on it, by anybody in the world except a founder. A founder can cut it out cold, keep the shape, melt it in a ladle over a chafing dish, and run it back into the hasp when he is done, and press the same stamp into the same soft face. And the stamp was in her satchel. And she had watched her father do it a dozen times, and she had done it herself at 9 years old, standing on a beer crate in the furnace house with her tongue between her teeth while he held the lamp. The lead came out in one piece, warm and heavy in her palm, with the crowned sea looking up at her. The door swung in 6 inches and stopped against the grit of 6 years, and the smell came out. She had expected damp. What came out was dry, dusty, faintly sweet, with the ghost of hot metal at the back of it, the smell of a foundry 2 days after a pour, and under it the smell of hemp and tallow and old wood, and under that, very faint, the smell of a church. The ringing chamber was 20 feet square with a stone floor. Her lamp went up the walls and found the peal boards, painted in 1782, recording a full peal of grandsire triples rung by 8 men whose names were still legible. It found the ropes, or where the ropes had been, 8 round holes in the boarded ceiling, and out of 5 of them a stub of hemp hanging down, cut on the slant, from below. The sallies were gone. Every one. In the middle of the floor, where a bell founder digs his pit when the parish will not pay to have the metal brought 40 miles by road, there was a great slab of new stone 8 feet by 8, bedded in mortar, with 4 iron rings in it. And on the sill of the north window there was a tin box. Rosamund knew tin boxes. Every founder in England had one. Gauges, a rule, a pair of calipers, the compass card for setting out the shape, a stub of chalk, and the daybook. Her father's tin box, with the dent in the lid where he used to knock the loam off, sitting on a window sill in a sealed room in another man's tower, where he had put it down 6 years ago and left it. She sat on the floor of the ringing chamber with her back against the cold wall and the lamp beside her, and read the whole of it, from the first page to the last, and the rain went on outside, and somewhere below her in the dark the metal lay under 8 feet of stone. Most of it was work. Weights and notes, the tuning of the 4th at Ashpriors, a quarrel with a carrier about a broken tackle, then the July of 1811, and the Kelverne peal, 6 bells, the 10 or 20 100-weight, and page after page of ordinary happy craft, because it was the biggest job her father ever had. Then the last week of August, and the hand changed. Would not dry. Told his grace so. He will not hear it. The peal must ring on the 15th for the regent's party, and he has told the county so, and will not be made a fool. I said we may fire the core a week more and pour on the 22nd. He said the 12th or no money. 12th, mould still sweating at the crown. Told his grace before 4 witnesses that the mould is green, and I will not answer for it. He said I was a coward and a tradesman, and he would have Rudhall from Gloucester if I would not run it. He gave the order himself, in the pit, at 6:30. Lord Ware took my part. He is a young man, and it did him no good. He said in front of the men, sir, that is Cray's trade and not yours, and his grace told him to hold his tongue and stand back. And then, in a hand that had gone all to pieces, it blew at 10 minutes before 7. God have mercy. Bligh, Redfern, Ganton, the boy. My own boy in the pit with the runner going, and I could not get down for the heat. Lord Ware went down. He went down into it for my Nathaniel and for the Redfern lad, and had the metal over him at the second blow, and came up with the boy on his arm, and could not see out of one eye, and never made a sound, and I stood at the top, and did nothing, and I am 51 years of age. She turned the page. Her hands were not steady. The inquest, at the George in Marchford, the 29th of August, 1811. His Grace has told Mr. Salter that the fault is mine, and that I ran a green mould for greed of the money, and he will swear to it, and have me indicted for manslaughter. Salter says a jury of this county will convict a founder in an hour. God help my wife and my girl and the boy. And then, the following day, Lord W. has this evening had himself carried into the room, and has sworn before the crowner that he gave the order to pour, over my warning being drunk. It is a lie. He was not drunk, and he gave no order. He says a coroner's jury cannot touch him, and it can hang me, which is true. He asked me one question only, whether I would take money for the widows and see it paid quietly, and I said I would. They asked me on my oath, did you warn Lord Ware, and did he bid you pour? And I said yes, that is all I said. One word. I have not slept since. He asked nothing of me but that I would seal the tower and say nothing while any of us lives, and I have run the lead this day with my own stamp on it, so that if it is ever broke open, it shall be a Cray that broke it. God forgive me. I do not ask that any man else should. She came out of the tower at 4 in the morning. She ran the lead back into the hasp with her own hands, and set her father's stamp into it while it was soft, and pressed it square, and when it was cold you could not have told that any living soul had touched it since 1811. Then she went up to the house and sat in the hall next to a coiled bell rope until it got light. He came down at 7. He looked at her dress, which was wet to the knee and had mortar dust on it, and at her hands, which were black, and at the tin box on the marble table beside the rope. He did not ask her how. He stood quite still in the grey light, and said only, "Ah." 6 years, said Rosamund. Yes, you let them say it. You have let Mercy Ganton stand in her doorway and watch your carriage go past for 6 years, and think you killed her husband and her son, and you have paid her £12 a quarter to do it in a dry house. Yes, why? She stood up. You are not a saint, and I will not have you be one, because I have to live with you. Tell me why. Because on the 30th of August 1811, said the Duke of Kelverne, I swore an oath before a coroner that was false in every particular, and your father swore one word after me that was false, and those are both crimes, and mine is nothing. I am a duke. They would not prosecute me, they would only despise me, and they do that already, and I have got used to it. Your father was a tradesman with a bad name and a burned son, and £11 in the bank. He came further into the hall. If I had recanted in the first year, he would have been indicted for perjury and for manslaughter together, and this county would have hanged him or transported him, and your mother would have gone on the parish, and your brother would have been apprenticed to nobody at all, because nobody takes a hanged man's boy. And after he died, said her husband, the only proof I have in the world that I did not kill 4 men is written in his hand, and it is a confession that he perjured himself and took money to keep quiet for 6 years. That is the whole of it. There is nothing else. The men who were in the pit are dead. My father is dead. The witnesses were his servants, and they were paid, and they have scattered. There is one book, and it clears me, and it destroys the name of Cray forever in this county, and by the time I could have used it you were 19 years old and quoting for church work under that name with your father's mark on the letter paper. He stopped. So no. I would rather be what they think I am. It is not nobility, madam. It is only arithmetic. There is nothing to be bought with that book that is worth what it costs. Rosamund said, You married me. I married a woman who had every reason on earth to want that door shut forever, said the Duke, and I thought her the safest wife in England. I was wrong about that too. They did not speak for 2 days. On the 3rd day, Aubrey Stern's attorney sent notice that the commission would sit at the Assembly Rooms at Marchford on the 29th of September, that Dr. Lemon would depose, and that the jury would require a view of the parish church tower of Nether Kelverne, the sealing of which was the 2nd article of the petition, and that if His Grace declined to produce the key, or the seal, or an explanation, the commission would draw such inference as it saw fit. There was no key. There had never been a key. That was the trap, and Aubrey Stern had walked round it 3 times, looking for the door. He will not get in, said the Duke. No, said Rosamund. He will not have to. He only has to stand a jury of farmers in front of a door you will not open and say, Gentlemen. Would a sane man do that? And they will go back to the George and find you a lunatic before their dinner is cold. Then they will find me a lunatic. And Aubrey Stern will have the estate, and the first thing he will do is pull that tower down and sell 2,100 weight of bell metal, and it will go to Bristol in a cart and come back as happens, and the day book will go in the fire with it, and there will not be one thing left in England to say what you did. She was shaking. He has already had a surveyor over the churchyard wall. Follett saw him. They were measuring the tower for scaffold. He said nothing. Open it yourself, she said, in front of them. Let me raise the bell out of that pit in front of 23 freeholders and the whole parish, and let me read the book aloud with my own mouth. I have told you what that costs. You have told me what it costs my father, said Rosamund Cray. You have never once asked what it is worth to me, and you have no right at all to spend a dead man's shame on his own family's behalf without asking the living. She rode to Netherfold that afternoon and told her mother everything. She had thought it would take an hour. It took 4 minutes. Eleanor Cray sat at the kitchen table in the house she had been told for 6 years was rented from a man in Bristol, and listened to her daughter. And when Rosamund got to the money, her mother put her hand flat on the table and said, "I knew about the money." Rosamund stopped. Not what it was for. Not that. Her mother's voice was quite steady, and her face had gone the color of paper. "But I keep the books, Rosamund. I have kept them since before you were born. There was never a year we earned what we spent, not after the Kelverne job. And your father would not tell me where it came from, and I stopped asking, because I was frightened of the answer and because Nathaniel wanted a surgeon." She looked up. "I have hated that man over this table every Sunday of my life, and I have fed my children on his money, and I knew I was doing it." "Mother, read the book," said Eleanor Cray. "Read all of it, and read it out loud, and put your father's name in the newspapers, and let them say what they like about the Crays. I would rather be the widow of a coward than go on being the widow of a good man who let somebody else carry it." Nathaniel was in the yard, she told him last, and worst, and he heard her out with his good ear turned toward her, standing very still with his scarred forearms folded, and at the end of it he said, "Say the part again. The part about who came down into the pit." She said it again. Her brother stood in the yard for a while looking at the ground. Then he said, in a strange, careful voice, like a man setting something down on a shelf too high for him, "I've been remembering it wrong for 6 years. I thought it was da. Net there were hands," he said. "I remember the hands more than the fire. Gloves on them, and the leather was all going. And whoever it was had his arm over my face so I couldn't see, and he was saying something the whole way up. Over and over, and I could never get hold of what it was." He looked up, and his eyes were streaming, and his voice had not changed at all. It was, "Hold on to me." The commission sat at 11 o'clock on Michaelmas Day in the assembly rooms at Marchford before a jury of 23 freeholders, with 2 barristers, a commissioner in a wig, Dr. Lemon in a black coat, and about 200 people from 4 parishes packed in at the back, who had no business there whatsoever. Aubrey Stern's case took 2 hours and was, Rosamund had to admit, beautifully done. The 9 servants where there had been 40. The shut rooms. The refusal of the bishop. The unexplained quarterly payments. Here he was very good indeed. Very sorrowful. A man forced to expose a kinsman's derangement in open court. And then the Tower. 6 years, gentlemen, a parish church, sealed with lead by His Grace's own order, no service of bells at a wedding, a christening or a burial, in the parish where 4 men of your own county lie in the ground. And when this commission asks, civilly, to see inside, there is no key. There has never been a key. He turned to the jury with his hands spread. "I put it to you as neighbors. Is that grief? Or is that a mind that has gone somewhere none of us can follow?" Then the Duchess of Kelverne stood up. She was 24 years old, in a plain grey gown with her father's leather satchel over her arm, and she asked the commissioner's leave to address the court, and the commissioner, who had never in 11 years had a duchess ask him anything, gave it. "Sir," said Rosamund, "the jury want a view of the Tower." "So do I. I have a set of sheer legs, 4 men and a windlass standing in the churchyard at Nether Kelverne since 7 this morning. And with His Grace's leave and yours, I will open that door in front of every man here, and take up what is under the floor of it. And then You may all decide what sort of a man seals a tower." There was uproar. It took the commissioner 4 minutes to get the room quiet, and when it was quiet, Aubrey Stern was on his feet, saying that this was theatre, that his cousin's wife was an interested party and a tradeswoman, and that the commission could not be dragged 3 miles into a field. "It is a churchyard, Mr. Stern," said the commissioner, "and I have been sitting in this room since 11. We will walk." They walked. 240 people went the 3 miles from Marchford to Nether Kelverne on the Michaelmas Day of 1817 along the Western Road, in the sun, with the commissioner's clerk carrying the papers under his arm, and the village came out of its houses and joined on at the back, and Mercy Ganton walked the whole way in her black gown, about 6 feet from the Duke of Kelverne, and never once looked at him. Rosamund cut the lead out herself in front of all of them, and held it up so the jury could see the mark on it, and said, in a voice that carried right to the churchyard wall, "That is a crowned C over a bell, gentlemen. That is my father's mark." Josiah Cray sealed this door. Ask yourselves why, and keep asking it, because I mean to answer it in about an hour. It took 2 hours and 10 minutes to get the slab up, and the tackle rigged, and the metal moving. She had the 4 rings chained to the sheer legs, and the men on the windlass, and she stood down in the pit, herself, with a lamp on a pole and a rule in her hand, calling the lift, and nobody in that crowd said one word about a woman in a hole in the ground in her petticoat, because by then they had seen what was in it. Great Kelverne came up out of the earth at 4:15 in the afternoon. 2,100 hundredweight of bell metal, split from the crown to the sound bow in 3 places, with 1/3 of the waist blown clean away and lying in pieces around it, and half its face still wearing the burnt loam of the mould it had died in. She had them chalk it on timbers on the grass in front of the tower door, where every soul could get near it. Then she stood on a mounting block and taught the county of Wiltshire, for 20 minutes, how to read a bell. She showed them the crown and the little blisters over the whole of one shoulder, in a sheet the size of peas. "Steam," she said. "That is what wet loam does when 4,000 pounds of metal comes down on it. It does not burn. It flashes to steam, and it must go somewhere, and it goes up through the metal." She showed them where the mould had let go at the waist and spilled the metal out sideways into the pit. That is the blow, gentlemen. That is what killed Wilfrid Bligh. That is what a green mould does. And there is not a man standing here who has ever fired a kiln or dried a rick who does not know that a thing cannot be hurried dry. She showed them the inside of the mould crown, still lying in the pit, with the founder's date scratched into the loam in her father's own hand, which is a thing every founder does the day the mould is closed, 22 Og. The mould was set to be poured on the 22nd, she said. It was poured on the 12th. 10 days green. My father wrote that date with a nail before ever the metal was in the furnace, and it has been in the ground ever since, and neither he nor his grace nor anybody else has laid a finger on it. That is not evidence anybody made up. That is baked into it. Then Mr. Follett, 66 years old, steward at Kelverne for 31 of them, came out of the crowd holding the 5th Duke's letter book, and read out, in a voice like a door opening, an entry dated the 9th of August 1811, in the old Duke's hand to his own agent. "Tell Cray he pours on the 12th, or he does not touch a penny of my money, and I will have Rudolph from Gloucester and put it about in the county that Cray is a drunkard. The peal shall ring on the 15th. I will answer for it." And then Rosamund Cray took her father's daybook out of the leather satchel and read the last 4 pages of it aloud, standing beside a broken bell, in front of her mother and her brother, and 4 widows and 23 jurymen, and the entire parish of Nether Kelverne, in a clear, flat voice that only failed her twice. She read the part where a 51-year-old man stood at the top of a pit and could not go down. She read the part where a young man of 28 had himself carried into an inn and swore a lie on oath so that a tradesman should not hang. She read, "They asked me on my oath, 'Did you warn Lord Ware, and did he bid you poor?' And I said, 'Yes, that is all I said.' 1 word. I have not slept since." And she said, when she had finished and closed the book, "My father was a coward for 1 word, on 1 day, when he was frightened for his children. He paid for it every day after, and so did we. And I am not going to stand here and tell you he was a good man, because a good man would have said the other word. But my husband has carried that word for him for 6 years, and he has fed the widows of the men who died out of his own pocket the whole time, and he let you all call him a murderer rather than let it come out, because if it came out it would land on me." She looked at the jury. "You have been asked to say whether he is out of his mind. He is not. He is the only man in this parish who has behaved exactly the same way for 6 years, whether anybody was watching or not, and I would be obliged if you would say so. It was not the day book that broke them, in the end. It was not the letter book either. It was Nathaniel Cray, 18 years old, walking out of the crowd with his sleeves rolled up past the scars, and going to the Duke and saying loudly enough for the back of the churchyard to hear, 'Say it to me again, sir.' And the Duke of Kelverne, who had not spoken since Marchford, looked at him for a long moment and said, quite quietly, 'Hold on to me.' And the boy said, 'That's it. That's the voice. That's who came down.' The jury was out 11 minutes, which the commissioner said afterwards was the shortest he had known. They found that His Grace was of sound mind and perfectly capable of the management of his affairs, and the foreman who farmed 300 acres at Ashcott and had lost a cousin in the pit added a rider that was not asked for and had no standing in law whatever, to the effect that the county had been wrong for 6 years and was ashamed of it. Aubrey Stern had gone before the verdict. His surveyor's contract for the sale of the Tower metal dated the 11th of September, 18 days before he stood up and asked 23 men to protect his poor mad cousin from himself, was published in the Marchford paper the following Saturday, and he did not return to that county. The village did not apologize all at once. Villages never do. It came in small pieces over a long autumn, a brace of birds left at the lodge with no note, the shop at Marchford sending the account up instead of asking for it at the door, Mr. Peveril, weeping openly, preaching a sermon on the 15th Sunday after Trinity that was so bad and so honest that people talked about it for years. Mercy Ganton came up the drive on the last day of October with a parcel done up in a cloth. She would not come in. She stood in the porch and gave it to Rosamund and said, "There's 5. The other 3 is with Sarah Bligh, and she'll bring 'em when she can look at you." And then to the Duke, who had come out and was standing bare-headed in the cold, "You should have told me, sir, I know," he said. "You should have told me," said Mercy Ganton, and her face came apart, because I've stood in my door and hated you 6 year, and I've a deal of hating still in me, and nowhere left to put it. Inside the cloth were 5 Sallys, cut off the ropes 6 years ago and kept. Cream and grey, worn shiny, one of them mended along the whip with a bit of blue thread by somebody who had done it carefully. They cast the new tenor in the same pit at Nether Kelverne in the March of 1818, because Rosamund would not hear of taking the metal 40 miles by road when the pit was already dug, and the parish had a subscription of £220 standing at Ford Abbas, that its rector, hearing the whole story, had rather magnificently released. She fired the core for 19 days. She had Nathaniel on the gauges, and 4 of Bligh's and Redfern's sons on the furnace, because she would not take a man from outside the parish for that job, and half the county came and stood on the wall to watch a duchess in a leather apron, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow. On the day she went round the mould with the flat of her hand 3 times, and made everybody wait a further 4 days. Then they poured, on a still morning, with the frost still in the grass, and it ran clean, and 19 days later they broke out a bell. It came up out of the ground, grey and perfect, and rang under the hammer like something the earth had been keeping. Round the shoulder, in the raised letters of the old alphabet her father had used all his life, it said, "I was broke by haste, and made again by truth." Josiah Cray made me. Rosamund his daughter made me again. For Bligh Redfern Ganton his son, and on the waist, side by side, there were 2 marks, a crowned C over a bell, and beside it newly cut, and a little rough, because she had cut the pattern for it herself with a knife, and had not been quite able to keep her hand steady. The same crown over the letters R.K. They hung it on the 8th of May, and they rang the peal on the 9th, and it was the first time the bells of Nether Kelverne had spoken since the 12th of August 1811. Rosamund did not ring. She had meant to. When it came to it, she found she wanted to be outside, in the churchyard, where you can feel a tenor through the soles of your feet. The whole parish was in there, standing among the graves with their faces turned up like people out in weather, and her husband was standing a little apart, at the corner of the tower on the north side, where the grass was always wet, bare-headed in the May sunshine, with his gloves in his hand. She went and stood beside him. Above them the peal came round and round, and the great new tenor came in at the end of every change with a note that got into the ribs. He was not looking at the tower. He had his eyes shut, and his face turned up into the light, the whole of it, the ruined side and the other, in front of 400 people, in the middle of the day. Rosamund Stern, Duchess of Kelverne, reached up and put her hand flat against the scarred side of her husband's face, in the daylight, in front of the entire county. He did not flinch. He turned his cheek into her palm, and stood there with the bells going, and after a while he said, without opening his eyes, the first entirely light thing she had ever heard him say. "It is not green, then, your mould." "It was never green," said his wife. "It was only ever waiting."